Hello, good morning for those of you on the East Coast, and good afternoon for those of you other places. And if you're watching this in the middle of the night by the magic of Wi-Fi, gosh, you like Wi-Fi even more than me. So my hat's off to you and thank you for joining us. My name is Ellen Satterwhite and welcome to today's digital event, Full Spectrum Future Connecting America. I'm thrilled that you all have joined us, co-hosted by the Open Technology Institute and the International Center for Law and Economics and WifiForward. So in case you haven't heard the very exciting news, yesterday, Chairman Pai announced that he and his colleagues will vote on a proposal to make use of the 5.9 gigahertz band at their upcoming November open meeting. For the uninitiated, though I suspect there are a few of you on this webinar, this means that the FCC will soon create a new Wi-Fi channel that will allow companies and institutions to offer gigabit speeds to homes, schools, and hospitals, sometimes with just a quick software update. So this is huge news for anyone who uses Wi-Fi. It's huge news for consumers. It's, I think we will talk a little bit about how it is also huge news in the auto safety world. So we are very excited to be joined by the chairman this morning. And we'll kick things off with a fireside chat featuring FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, moderated by ICLE's Ian Adams. And then we'll have a panel of industry experts and third parties who've been following this issue for a very long time. Michael Calabrese of OTI's New America will moderate this conversation with Deborah Collier from Citizens Against Government Waste, Harold Feld from Public Knowledge, Danielle Piñeras of NCTA, and Mark Radabaugh of Amplex and a board member of WISPA. So first, some housekeeping. If you're tweeting along with us, please use our hashtag Full Spectrum Future, all one word, obviously, to follow the conversation. And for the sake of time, we're not accepting questions during the webinar through the chat feature, but we are recording this session. So after the event, we'll upload the video to YouTube and circulate it via email. Now I'd like to introduce Ian Adams, who will lead a question and answer session with Chairman Ajit Pai about this important topic. Ian is Executive Director of the International Center for Law and Economics. It's a think tank here in Washington, D.C. that promotes the use of law and economics methodologies to inform public policy debates. His substantive policy work focuses on the disruptive impact of burgeoning technologies on law and regulation, with a particular concentration on automation and the future of work, privacy, and insurance. Relevant to today's conversation are two things. Number one, he's written extensively on the disposition of the 5.9 gigahertz band. And number two, he is using Wi-Fi today to be connected with family. So I'm just gonna give a shout out because I know Ian's mom is watching and we're very excited to have her. So with that, just very embarrassing tidbit, but the magic of Wi-Fi, I will turn it over to Ian.
Thanks so much, Ellen. I am thrilled to be sitting here, albeit virtually, and certainly with my mom watching, but also thrilled to be sitting here with the chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai. For those of you who don't know, Ajit has served as chairman of the FCC since January of 2017. He previously served as an FCC commissioner from 2012 to 2017 and has been with the commission since 2007. He's a proud Kansas native and graduated from Harvard University and from the University of Chicago Law School. So with that, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Let's just jump right in. That sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay, well, yesterday you had a particularly busy day. You had a commission meeting, and then you made an announcement about improving Wi-Fi, setting another precedent for efficient spectrum policy, which has been a hallmark of your chairmanship. Perhaps you could just lead us off with a brief overview of that announcement.
I'd be happy to. First and foremost, though, I want to thank you, the International Center for Law and Economics, Open Technology Institute, and WifiForward for giving us this platform to discuss this really important issue. And the announcement, as Ellen hinted in the opening, was really exciting for me and hopefully for many consumers out there, that finally, after many years of discussion and debate, the FCC will vote on November 18th on my plan to free up the 5.9 gigahertz band for next generation uses. In particular, freeing up the lower 45 megahertz of that band, 5850 starting at 5850 for what's called Wi-Fi unlicensed operations, and the upper 30 for a new technology called Connected Vehicle to Everything, or CV to X. So we're hoping to promote Wi-Fi and automotive safety at the same time in a way that we haven't seen over the last 2 decades.
Well, I mean, that makes sense to me. You're taking spectrum that's sat largely unused for about the last 20 years, sharing some with Wi-Fi while still accommodating automotive safety concerns. So that's a pretty serious balancing of priorities. I wonder if you'd comment on the expected benefits that consumers can see both in Wi-Fi and with automotive safety from this development.
Well, I think the benefits on the Wi-Fi side are going to be tremendous. And I think the pandemic has only underscored that. The fact that consumers need much more connectivity, especially those who are working at home, who have young children studying at home, who need to be able to connect with a healthcare provider remotely and safely. For all of those things, Wi-Fi is incredibly important. And the extra 45 megahertz in the Wi-Fi spectrum at 5.9 is going to be a tremendous boost to that. And this is not just a theory. We actually have evidence that this has happened. On May 4th, the FCC put out a press release talking about some of the special temporary authority to use this 45 megahertz that we've given to fixed wireless companies, WISPs as they're called, across the country. And the results are just incredible. I don't want to steal Mark Radabaugh's thunder on the next panel, but Amplex, which is a WISP in Lucky, Ohio, saw an increase in traffic on its networks 30% during the pandemic. Thanks in part to the spectrum, they were able to increase bandwidth by 50%. Same thing with Skynet 360 in Florida City, Florida, was able to extend access to 100 homes in the rural Everglades. So yeah, alligators and Wi-Fi actually meshed well thanks to this SDA. And last but not least, Zirkle Wireless in Colorado, in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, was able to increase bandwidth tremendously and give people access who didn't have access before. This is a hint of the future we can secure for America's consumers if we get it right. And in my view, freeing up that 45 megahertz of spectrum in 5.9 gets it right. The same thing on the automotive safety side, by the way. I've seen connected vehicle to everything technology in the field at a trial, and it's really exciting. That's based on new cellular protocols, which of course we all use in our daily lives, and enabling cars to communicate with each other and with everything on the road, from pedestrians to light poles. I think it's going to be tremendous for automotive safety. And the incumbent technology just hasn't done the job. We think that CV2X will do the job and will help save lives.
So to be clear, this isn't a winner-take-all sort of a situation. The auto industry is still going to be able to deploy life-saving technologies, and I mean, they're not going to be locked in to DSRC technology anymore. So, I mean, how will this order enable innovation in the automotive space, and what do you see from the auto industry that excites you in particular?
Well, I think the fact that we are finally freeing up this band for innovation in the automotive safety space is tremendous. I mean, as you mentioned, since 1999, the FCC has essentially given the spectrum to some of the automotive companies for a specific technology, dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC. And over the last 2 decades plus, DSRC simply has not done the job. It is not protecting automotive safety, certainly not as the FCC or the automotive companies envisioned it. And look, wait till next year used to be the mantra for the Brooklyn Dodgers for many years. That wasn't good enough for the Los Angeles Dodgers, as we saw last night. The same thing with automotive safety. DSRC has had over 20 years to get the job done. Wait till next year is not a sufficient option for those who rely on their vehicles and who are around vehicles to stay safe. So we think the connected vehicle to everything technology is a way of making sure that everything can be sensed or can be connected in a way that will, in fact, en masse, keep all of these vehicles and pedestrians safe on the road.
Now, in terms of the process that has actually brought us to this point as we sit here today talking about that day in November, I think it's fair to say the FCC has teed up a fair few opportunities for engagement from interested parties. Yet we did see some fourth quarter filings here from the Department of Defense. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that DoD filing and how you were able to address some of its concerns while still providing benefits for consumers and the economy.
It's always great to work with our friends in other federal agencies. And in this case, it was actually a good working relationship. They outlined some of their concerns through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And we were able to work through those concerns in our view. And the document, which thanks to one of the process reforms I initiated, will become public this afternoon, I think will evidence the fact that, look, we took some of that input seriously. Just for context, for those who might know, in the Uni 3 band, which is directly below the 5.9 gigahertz band, we have accommodated DoD uses. They are actually primary for the Federal Radio Location Service in that band. And because of the protocols that we've established, there's actually been very little interference between unlicensed use of the Uni 3 band and those federal uses like DoD. We think in the Uni 4 band, the same type of accommodation can be reached here. So, I think parenthood in many cases is good preparation for handling spectrum policy. You have to, if you have few warring children, as you will probably soon find out, you have to find a way to work well in the sandbox, get them to share and everything. And I think that's exactly what we're doing in the 5.9 gigahertz band. Let's move the ball forward for American consumers who desperately need connectivity while accommodating some of those important interests, federal agencies, as well as automotive safety, so that we all win at the end of the day.
Well, that makes perfect sense. When it comes to deployment considerations, I'm curious how speed to market weighed into your decision here.
It certainly did. I mean, as you hinted earlier on, it's been a long slog at the FCC. And in the meantime, all the great engineers and technologists have already raced ahead. I mean, the 802.11ac was somewhat new when I became a commissioner in 2012. Now it's fully established, and all of the gear and equipment that relies on it has already been out there. In fact, that's part of what allows some of these WISPs to take advantage of the STAs we granted in 5.9 relatively quickly. And so just making sure that consumers are able to get that equipment if they want to get new AC compatible routers and the like, or other Wi-Fi connected devices, they'll be able to do so very quickly. And so our goal is always at the FCC to try to anticipate where consumers are going to go and then to meet that demand as soon as we can. Obviously, in some cases, we're a little bit behind where they are, but in this case, I think we're catching up in a really significant way.
Well, so then what's next? Moving forward, do you foresee the commission allowing more robust outdoor use in this band? And what are your thoughts about the transition timeline for the small number of DSRC projects that we see right now from the lower to the upper part of the band?
Good point, Saul. So certainly with respect to some of those issues involving the technical side of things, the power and emission limits, for example, or other things like that, we've teed up in the further notice of proposed rulemaking, which accompanies the report and order that we're going to be voting on, all of those questions. What should be the technical standards? What is the appropriate time frame? Because we ultimately want to get feedback from everybody on the best way to ensure that we maximize those complementary interests, automotive safety and Wi-Fi. So in the traditional FCC style, we're not saying what we think the answer must be right now. We're just opening up the conversation to that so we can make a fully informed decision at a later date.
Well, then to drill down a little bit further on what you expect to see in terms of consumer benefits on the Wi-Fi side, what will this additional 45 megahertz really mean?
It's going to mean a lot. If anybody is watching, you're probably using some sort of Wi-Fi spectrum, and every now and then the spectrum that you're using, either in the 2.4 gigahertz band or even in a different part of the 5 gigahertz band, can become congested. But this extra 45 megahertz really punches above its weight. For one thing, it's obviously new Wi-Fi spectrum, but in addition to that, it sits adjacent to some of the Uni 3 spectrum that's just below it. And so the ability to create a 160 megahertz wide channel for Wi-Fi is huge. I mean, the panelists know much better than I do what a difference that's going to make. But in a nutshell, that could mean gigabit Wi-Fi, indoors or outdoors, that would be able to supply really fast connectivity without anybody having to pay for it at a spectrum auction, for example, or the like. So, gigabit Wi-Fi sounds pretty good to me, and I'm sure it does to folks out there, whether you're a gamer or a learner, a telehealth operator, precision ag, whatever it is, Wi-Fi can really be an interesting solution for you.
Well, and it's certainly a critical time for people to be connected in light of what's going on with the pandemic. I wanted to reflect a little more generally on what you've done with your chairmanship. And I think, though, there's certainly someone who is watching who will correct me if I'm wrong, but you've released more spectrum for commercial use than any previous chair. What do you hope will be the outcome of this approach, and how do you intend to evaluate your success?
That's a good question. I mean, our goal has always been to put the building blocks in place for wireless innovation of all kinds. And traditionally, of course, that meant the FCC auctioning spectrum for the commercial marketplace. And we've certainly done that, auctions in the 24, 28, 37, 39, 47, 3.5, and coming up soon, the 3.7 band. We have an auction of the 2.5 and 3.45 next year. In terms of cellular spectrum, no question, huge amount of influx of supply. But what was really important to me was not just for us to make sure that you could get spectrum only if you paid and got a license through an FCC auction. The unlicensed innovation has been so critical to the internet economy in the United States over the last generation that we wanted to make sure that in the future, there's going to be an on-ramp for the entrepreneurs and innovators who are out there. So we freed up the 6 gigahertz band, as you might know, the entire 6 gigahertz band from 5925 to 7125 for unlicensed innovation, both indoors and outdoors. And that 1200 megahertz swath is going to be a game changer for American consumers and entrepreneurs. And we got a lot of pressure to license some of that, half of it or all of it. But it was important to me to give a home to those who just wanted to play with the technologies of the future, things we can't even anticipate, and let them come up with the next great application or service that relies on unlicensed spectrum. So the 5.9 gigahertz initiative we're talking about now is a piece of that, giving a home to those who, the wild and crazy innovators out there who have the great AR or VR or whatever it is application. We just want to give them a place to set up shop here in the United States and to thrive. And I would note, by the way, that our decision is having positive impacts on the other parts of the world too. South Korea has decided to move forward with 6 gigahertz, and our understanding is Brazil is seriously considering doing the same. So there's a rising tide for Wi-Fi that's going to raise all boats around the world, hopefully.
Well, so with that, I mean, I would be banished from ICLE if I didn't ask at least one question explicitly grounded in law and economics. So for more than 50 years, ever since the publication of Ronald Coase's seminal work on spectrum management, to your point, there's been a debate about the most effective and efficient way of allocating spectrum. What is the history of this band, in particular, 5.9, tell us about spectrum management and property rights?
And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, as a Chicago Law School graduate, we appreciate the law and econ perspective. And I think that perspective was vindicated in the most recent Nobel Prize for economic science. To see Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson get that award was just a vindication of their work, as well as the work of FCC staff like Evan Correll. But I think it also indicates the folly of the FCC trying to pick winners and losers and give spectrum for free to those who ultimately don't use it to its highest value use. That's exactly what happened in 5.9. In 1999, as I mentioned, we gave the spectrum to the automotive industry for this particular technology. And instead of developing it, which you might have more of an incentive to do in other circumstances, they essentially squatted on it and they didn't use it to its highest valued use. And so it's come to the point where even those in the automotive industry who are looking to the future have said, look, if we want to do CV2X, we can't do that because of the 1999 restrictions placed on us by the FCC. There's no reason for the incumbents to innovate here. So what we've done is to, again, to try to split that baby to allow Wi-Fi to move forward. Wi-Fi is created in the same year, essentially, as DSRC, but it's gone way past it. And at the same time, allow the next generation of automotive safety technologies to have a chance to succeed. And so, here, I think we've applied the lessons of Ronald Coase as best we can, even though it's an unlicensed type of operation that we're talking about.
One final question for you. So in light of the unprecedented challenges that have arisen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen consumer behavior change. For instance, broadband use in the home has gone way up. Now, American networks have performed well and handled this surge in activity, while networks in Europe have not fared as well. There's always a discussion around that last mile in telecom, which is to say how broadband actually gets into our home. I'm curious, how does Wi-Fi and the 5.9 band fit into that equation?
It fits in quite well. It's one thing to have a very strong fixed broadband connection to your house, but if you don't have sufficient Wi-Fi spectrum to enable that router to reach your device, then essentially you've got a road to nowhere. And that's exactly why the 5.9 gigahertz band proposal is so important, is so important, to be able to amp up the amount of Wi-Fi spectrum that's available for consumers in their homes in particular. Then you ramp up the amount of bandwidth that they can take advantage of. All these great fixed broadband networks that are being built, consumers can actually leverage them in their homes, whether it's an iPad that a student is studying on, or a connected TV, a refrigerator, you name it. All of these devices can be used over that 5.9 gigahertz spectrum. So to me, I think the old paradigm of seeing a cellular or fixed broadband on one side as the opponent of Wi-Fi is completely wrong. These are complementary technologies, not rival technologies. And here, I think the pandemic, as you mentioned, has only underscored the importance of this. Here too, that I don't think there's any political aspect to this question at all. It's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It's an American issue to make sure that in this pinch that consumers are in, the FCC and advocates like all of you do everything we can to meet that need. And I think that that's exactly what we've done in the 5.9 gigahertz band.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I am inclined to agree with you. Thank you so much for your time and for being here today. And with that, I will turn things back to Ellen, who is going to key up our panel for their thoughts on what they've just heard.
Thanks so much, Ian. And Miss Adams, your son done good.
Thanks.
Thank you both. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for joining us, and Ian for leading such a great conversation and allowing us this point of personal privilege to talk to your mother. We at WifiForward are very excited about the possibilities for innovation in this band. We're very excited about the possibilities to connect so many people. So for some more reactions to this news and another great conversation, I'll turn things over to our esteemed panel, helmed by OTI's Michael Calabrese. So a little bit about Michael. He's the director of the Wireless Future Project, which is part of New America's Open Technology Institute. He also serves as a senior research fellow affiliated with the Asset Building Program. He wrote one of the first pieces about the possibilities for the 5.9 gigahertz band several years ago. Taught me a lot of what I know about this band and has raised great questions over the years. This summer, he co-authored a study on the 5.9 gigahertz band, including talking about its history and accompanying policy recommendations. So he is a true expert, joined by other true experts. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Great. Well, thank you, Ellen. And thanks to WifiForward as well for really hanging in there when I think many were either tired or losing interest in pushing this over the finish line. As you said, it's taken quite a bit of time because of the competing interests, but we're so thankful that Chairman Pai and actually all the commissioners, we would expect a 5-0 vote on this because they all appreciate the importance. So as you said, I'm joined by a great panel today to comment on this, all individuals who've played a role in this progress on this band. So what I think I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists an opening question, and if they could, begin by telling us a bit about, by way of self-introduction, tell us a bit about the role your organization has played in this debate. In other words, where you're coming from on this. And I will start with Danielle Piñeres from NCTA. Danielle, what will adding 45 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band mean for the consumer broadband experience? In particular, why are broadband providers so focused on this slice of spectrum when the FCC voted in April to make a much larger amount, 1200 megahertz, available for shared unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz band above?
Sure, thanks, Michael. And for those watching, I'm Danielle Piñeres, Vice President and Associate General Counsel at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, where I work primarily on wireless spectrum policy issues. And just a brief thanks so much to WifiForward and ICLE and OTI for hosting and for inviting me to speak, and also to Michael for moderating this panel and for your good questions. So, by way of background, NCTA has been involved in the 5.9 gigahertz proceedings since the very beginning, recognizing that broadband providers could quickly make efficient use of this virtually unused 5.9 gigahertz spectrum in order to bring faster Wi-Fi to American consumers. And that Wi-Fi access, as Chairman Pai touched on, is really more important now than ever before as Americans work and learn and access telehealth services and more, all from our homes and mostly relying on our Wi-Fi connections. NCTA has compiled data from cable broadband providers during the pandemic and found that broadband growth is up, right? We found that downstream peak traffic was up 20.1% in the early weeks of the pandemic, and that networks have seen upstream peak traffic growth of 37.1% since March 1st. And because much of this broadband activity is taking place over Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi data traffic, Wi-Fi calling are up as well. So in short, we really need our Wi-Fi connections more than ever before. And we need wide bandwidth Wi-Fi channels to keep up with consumer demand and support the latest technology. NCTA's members can deliver gigabit wired broadband speeds throughout most of their footprints. And Chairman Pai alluded to this. We want consumers to get the benefit of those speeds all the way to their Wi-Fi connected devices and not have those speeds stop at the router. The 5.9 band is really well positioned to meet the need for faster wide bandwidth Wi-Fi soon. It's right next to the most widely used Wi-Fi band in the world, Uni 3, which means two things. American consumers could have access to a commercially viable gigabit Wi-Fi channel of 160 megahertz. And the band can also be brought online very quickly through a software or firmware update to many devices in the field today. So that's really what makes 5.9, I think, a great complement to 6 gigahertz, Michael, to your question. While 6 gigahertz is going to take some time to bring online, it's going to require deployment of new equipment, development of new database access technology. Some existing Wi-Fi equipment can be upgraded via software firmware update to access 5.9. Second, I think the sharing environment is really different here. The beauty of what the commission proposed, what Chairman Pai talked about today, is that we're talking about being good neighbors to auto safety operations in 5.9 gigahertz. And that's just technically easier than what's happening in the 6 gigahertz band, where it's just a different environment. And what the commission did there was to enable shared co-channel access to spectrum with existing incumbent users. In the 6 gigahertz band, folks will have to abide by the protection mechanisms that the FCC adopted to protect incumbent users there, a database to coordinate standard power applications and using low power levels for indoor-only operations there. And so, what we hope to see in when the draft items released later today is that the 5.9 gigahertz band isn't going to need to be subject to such extensive restrictions in order to ensure adjacent channel coexistence, which is going to provide more flexibility to Wi-Fi users in the band to implement a variety of use cases. So, in short, we're just really excited about the chairman's plan to move forward with a band split approach here to enable gigabit Wi-Fi here in the near term.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. And we'll roll back again later. I think about, again, the importance of having that gigabit fast channel potentially available more quickly than 6 gigahertz, since this is really a critical, time that we're in. So next up is Mark Radaba, who from Amplex. And Mark, I just want to ask you, since the coronavirus crisis began, and Chairman Pai mentioned this, your company and roughly 100 other WISPs have been using this 45 megahertz on an emergency basis to help narrow the rural digital divide. How is that working out? And do you think coordinated outdoor use can work over the next year or so while incumbents transition to the top portion of the band?
Thank you for the question. The chairman said something in his speech that I believe he said making the spectrum available relatively quickly. I almost laughed because it wasn't relatively quickly. It was absolutely amazingly quickly. I have never seen anything move that fast in the spectrum world. And after COVID hit, this process was going on. Steve Coran with the Lerman Center volunteered to help us draft STAs, a lot of WISPA members to draft STAs to access the spectrum. And those were granted very quickly.
Oh, Mark, tell us what an STA is.
Oh, Special Temporary Authority or Authorization. I'm not actually sure which one it is. To use spectrum. So it's a request made to the FCC to give us emergency or quick authority to do something. So they did do this very quickly, which was amazing in itself, how fast that moved. And making the spectrum available, what's really amazing about the spectrum is it is utterly, completely adjacent to the existing spectrum we already have. Radios made for worldwide use by manufacturers can already access the spectrum. They're restricted by license restrictions or software in the US to stay out of this spectrum, this 45 megahertz of spectrum. So with the STA in hand, we went back to our manufacturer and said, hey, we have legal authority here right in our hot little hands. Can you make an exception for us or a software load for us? And several different manufacturers, Cambium, Mimosa, I believe Ubiquity, all made that spectrum available actually within days. So within, I would say 2 weeks, we were on the air using existing equipment no truck rolls, over-the-air software upgrade, and using the spectrum. The other amazing thing about it is not so much that we want to use it in really wide channels for gigabit connectivity, but we can take a 20 meg channel that we were using, widen it to 30%, get 50% more utilization out of it, or even double it to 40 megahertz, because now we have room to move all the other access points into this new 45 megahertz of spectrum. So not only do we get much more use out of the upper 45, we get much more use out of the remaining spectrum just by being able to rearrange channels. It was amazingly quick and incredibly helpful in meeting the amazing surge in bandwidth we saw due to COVID-19.
Great, thanks, Mark. And third, we have Deborah Collier from Citizens Against Government Waste. Deb, as Chairman Pai stated, after 20 years, the auto industry has left the 5.9 gigahertz band parked and idle and almost entirely unused. As an advocate against government waste, how does the FCC's announcement on 5.9 gigahertz affect the utilization of this public asset?
Actually, it really is going to be a benefit to all Americans. Citizens Against Government Waste has long maintained that public resources like spectrum should be maximized to its fullest potential. When the FCC designated the 5.9 gigahertz band for exclusively DSRC use, and then nothing happened with it for over 20 years, that was really not making good stewardship use of that spectrum. By splitting that spectrum down, with the lower 45 being for unlicensed use and then the upper 30 for currently DSRC applications and eventually CV to X, I think that's going to create a really good model going forward, with the fact that the spectrum sits right adjacent to the Uni 3 band, which is already being used for unlicensed. That's going to create one long 160 megahertz contiguous band of unlicensed spectrum that's going to be really easily used for Wi-Fi applications. And with the current pandemic, we're using Wi-Fi more than ever before. So having that increased bandwidth is just going to be critical moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Deb. And finally, for an introductory turn, we turn to Harold Feld from Public Knowledge, who is really for years been my partner in leading the public interest community for this outcome. So really happy to have him here. Harold, for consumers, what are the short-term and long-term benefits of the FCC's decision? Given the increasing demands for telehealth and other life-saving technologies during COVID, also, what do you think of the auto industry's claims that releasing this spectrum doesn't save lives?
Right. Well, first, Michael, I want to also thank you for all of the work you've done on this over the years. This has been, a tremendous labor on your part. And but there are a couple of things here that are important. All of the applications that we're talking about, like telemedicine, being able to work from home, education, especially multiple streams if you have a number of children in the house, all of whom are in a different class, all of these need access to more and better Wi-Fi, which is what we're seeing here. And again, this stuff is going to be downloaded super quickly because it can utilize the existing technology. As others have said, this is essentially a software update, so everyone will feel the effects immediately. I also want to add that while we talk about rural broadband here, we also should emphasize the importance of this in urban, closing the urban digital divide as well. I am not a fan of the fact that we have to rely on Wi-Fi hotspots for many people to gain access because they don't have broadband in the home. But since that's where we are now, they need those Wi-Fi hotspots need to be able to support, 50, 100 people who are using them, using these same high bandwidth applications. So this is huge. As for the auto industry's claim, I like to say my actual telemedicine saves more lives than your imaginary technology. The fact is that for all of the hyperbolic claims that the automotive industry has made, DSRC is a lousy anti-collision technology. There are many more superior technologies in the market. The industry has pledged to have something like 5 million cars out of 37 million cars with installed DSRC in what, 3 or 4 years? That's nothing in terms of the ability to, the number of miles that have been laid with DSRC sensitive infrastructure, despite expenditures from the Department of Transportation in some states, is less than your average, the length of your average state highway across a state. So absolutely, this shift is going to save lives, get rid of a technology, DRC, which is old, out of date, subject to serious cybersecurity concerns, and replace it with the C2VX, which leverages existing cellular technology.
Right. Yeah, thanks. And that's a great point, which we can double back to in a few minutes about the, what, if anything, we might be losing with respect to auto safety, because even back under the Obama administration, as you mentioned, when they were proposing a mandate, and they said that the only way this could work if they mandated it, and even then, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said it would take decades before they even knew if this would be reliable, because it has to be in the vast majority of the fleet of all the vehicles to even know whether it could work under real world conditions in terms of anything that's automated.
I'm also waiting to see how they're going to get the deer, which are the single largest factor in auto accidents, to wear their little DSRC sensors when they're going across roads.
And Harold just made an excellent point. For DSRC to be fully effective, it's got to be in every single vehicle on the road. You've got old cars on the road that people are not going to get rid of anytime soon. And they're not going to be able to communicate with any car operating with DSRC. There has to be two devices.
And the most solid commitment that's been given, as Harold mentioned, is that over the next 5 years, the auto industry is willing to put this in 5 million new vehicles over 5 years, but only if they can keep all 75 megahertz. So I can see why Chairman Pai and the FCC didn't think that was a deal worth taking. But let me come back now to a few things that you all mentioned at a high level and see if we can clarify it a bit more. So I don't know if this could be for Harold or anyone, but how will this order work in tandem with the FCC's 6 gigahertz decision in April? So can this unimpeded 160 megahertz provide a complementary and more immediate benefit to consumers and enterprise? So again, it's kind of about why do we need both exactly, and do they play slightly different roles and to work together?
Well, it's funny you should mention this because I'm actually moving next week. So when I called my cable company to shift over my broadband package, and they asked me if I wanted to get their router, I said, well, yeah, I'll take it for a couple of months, but I'm going to get a new router when the Wi-Fi 6E comes out this winter. So we're talking about equipment that is being manufactured and deployed now that will work together. And the 6E Wi-Fi, as it's called, this Wi-Fi that's especially designed to work in the 6 gigahertz band, is part of this overall upgrade that we're generically referring to as 5G, but that is all about increasing output to gigabit speeds. That works in complementary fashion with the 5G. All of these things work together. It works in complementary fashion with the TV white spaces. You know, nobody asks when we auction off spectrum for licensed mobile uses. Well, why do you need to auction off more spectrum? You know, wasn't the spectrum allocation that was made, 15 years ago still going to be good enough for 5G today? But we have people who are saying, we should just keep, the same spectrum allocations for Wi-Fi when the need for it is growing exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Michael, to your point, are they complementary? Is one a substitute for the other? I think we need both. They're different tools in the toolbox. I think, I alluded to this earlier, but the 6 gigahertz band is a huge amount of bandwidth. It's going to be game changing for Wi-Fi, no doubt about it. The FCC envisioned kind of two different mechanisms there: indoor low power operations that are significantly lower power than what we enjoy in the 5 gigahertz band or the 2.4 gigahertz band today. And then outdoor standard power operations, which will, could be great for a variety of applications, but will be subject to a database to coordinate and ensure protection for incumbent users. So the FCC had to impose some requirements there in the 6 gigahertz band to protect important incumbent operations that share that same spectrum. But again, here, the beauty of the chairman's plan is to split Wi-Fi, the lower 45 megahertz for Wi-Fi. And again, what's great about it is we just have to be good neighbors to ITS, to the automotive safety operations next door, which really, I think, opens up a whole new opportunity, different use cases for 5.9 than we might see in 6. I think, the commission has, at least in the NPRM process, focused on trying to ensure that these 5.9 rules look as much like the adjacent Uni 3 spectrum as possible. That's been a hugely successful Wi-Fi band for the United States, with countless numbers of devices deployed and using that spectrum regularly. It's so successful because it enables higher power operations, indoor, outdoor. There's a lot of flexibility there that we are sure hoping we see in the draft later today, extended up into the 5.9 gigahertz band. That gives us a lot more flexibility as broadband providers to do a lot of new and innovative things here, as well as the things that have really made Wi-Fi a success so far. So again, different tools in the toolbox, different use cases, different power levels that make both 6 gigahertz and this special swath of 45 megahertz at 5.9 really important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you made that's often overlooked, is that by adding on to the Uni 3 band, the unlicensed spectrum immediately below 5.9, what the commission's doing is providing 160 megahertz that it's available at standard power, in other words, full Wi-Fi power, both indoors and outdoors, and without any database requirement, and without any incumbent that you need to work around. That's another difference, because outdoors in 6 gigahertz, often the database is going to tell you, hey, you can't use it here because there's 50,000 fixed links that need to be worked around. Mark, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, so as a service provider, one of the biggest issues we have regarding slow speed complaints is not actually their internet connection. It is very, very often their Wi-Fi. Dealing with in-home Wi-Fi, and people throw magazines and other things on top of it. But as Harold said, he doesn't want his provider's router because he wants the new 6 gigahertz one. That's great, and I like our customers that are willing to go upgrade equipment is fantastic. But from a service provider standpoint, we also have our managed router services that we provide the Wi-Fi to our customers. There's thousands of devices out there that we can now push a software upgrade to enable this 45 megahertz and to help their in-home Wi-Fi if they allow this, with this ruling. So we can address, without having a truck roll, without replacing a whole lot of consumer equipment, a very common issue that people have in home, which is, again, their in-home Wi-Fi. We'll obviously start deploying new equipment to customers with the 6 gig band in it when it's available, but we can also go help a lot of people that have existing equipment without a lot of truck rolls, a lot of new equipment, and just a lot of messing around. It's very quick to do.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a perfect segue, because I'd wanted to, when I heard Danielle's opening, I wanted to come back, to the importance of the consumer's experience indoors, where 80% of Wi-Fi or more is used. So NCTA's recent filing on economic benefits emphasized that adding this 45 megahertz to existing Wi-Fi routers operating today on the adjacent 5.8 Wi-Fi band will give consumers a badly needed boost in Wi-Fi capacity and therefore quality. Can you speak to the importance of bringing this band online with existing equipment, and when that can happen? Can that happen right away, or is it a big deal? And even if indoor use comes first, why is outdoor use at standard power important as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael, and great questions. First, to the economic benefits, we do expect that those will be substantial here. There's a recent study by Dr. Raul Katz, who's looked at these unlicensed spectrum valuation issues for a number of years. And he found that between 2020 and 2025, the anticipated economic value of just the lower 45 megahertz of 5.9 could be almost $30 billion for the US economy. So we really do expect significant economic benefits here. But to your point about sort of consumer benefits, we really expect that will be substantial as well. This is, again, another aspect of 5.9 that we think makes it special and different from 6 gigahertz. 6 gigahertz will require kind of new equipment deployment. Harold alluded to this, and Mark. But here, we're excited about the possibility of bringing this band online in existing Uni 3 equipment. And we think we can do that in a matter of months. In some cases, I think by early next year, with software firmware upgrades. And Mark's experience, the experience of the WISPs that have had SDA access to the band, really showcase how quickly this band can be used to bring broadband to American consumers. As you mentioned, Michael, indoor residential and business Wi-Fi operations are really a core part of the broadband services that NCTA's members provide. And this additional 160 megahertz channel that 5.9 gigahertz can enable will really quickly bring faster Wi-Fi to consumers inside their homes and businesses using equipment that's already deployed. But authorizing outdoor operations here, which it sounds like the commission may be poised to do in the near term through a further notice, is really also central to ensuring that the commission's rules support investment and deployment in 5.9 gigahertz equipment. NCTA and others have explained on the record why allowing outdoor use is key to maximizing Uni 4's value, really by fostering the development of a robust device ecosystem. It's not just routers, it's your phones and your tablets and things that are mobile and can be taken outdoors and things as well. So the potential for outdoor standard power operation in a new 160 megahertz channel is really important. And again, without the need for a coordination database is going to be required in 6 gigahertz. So, there's a kind of a unique opportunity for a new 160 megahertz channel that can be used outdoors without those restrictions here that could make 5.9 uniquely suited to different use cases like smart city or smart agriculture applications as well.
And it will be the only 160 megahertz channel that is standard power and completely unimpeded. Anyone else
the
have
only
something?
contiguous. Yeah, the only contiguous channel.
Yeah,
sure.
right.
Yeah, the entire fixed Wi-Fi business model is based on this unlicensed spectrum. And when it was released as outdoor unlicensed use, I don't believe anybody envisioned it being probably I would say the primary technology used by rural Americans to get their broadband service. That was never envisioned. Adding more to it has huge economic benefits. I would be at a loss to come up with a dollar value to put on it, but it is a very large number. And you would also spend a whole lot more money subsidizing rural broadband without the contribution that you're getting from this unlicensed spectrum.
That's right. And WISPs have been winning more and more of the universal service funding. So this can boost what, the bang for those bucks from the public in terms of capacity and reach and speed. So it's a question I think probably for Deb or any of you. The auto industry is calling 5.9 gigahertz the safety band and waving the bloody shirt and saying that's why they must keep all 75 megahertz. But the FCC has concluded that 30 megahertz is sufficient for any CV2X safety signaling that the industry may deploy in the future. How much of the band is being used for safety today? And should the auto industry be entitled to free spectrum beyond the 30 megahertz they need for critical safety services?
Right now, the DSRC is the only permitted use of the band. However, experimental licenses have been granted for CV2X applications, but they're minimal. And again, they're experimental. They're not really utilizing the full 75 megahertz of the band. 30 megahertz at the upper end of the channel is a good compromise for if we're going to open it up to CV2X. That's a good common standard. Many countries around the world operate on 30 megahertz or less. A few have more, but they're using that amount for auto safety. Here's the key thing though. DSRC is not being used for auto safety right now. It's really not being deployed. Only one car was manufactured with DSRC in it, and that car was discontinued the model year of 2019. So right now there aren't any cars being manufactured in the US with DSRC in it. And so calling this a safety band really is a misnomer.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Michael, you documented this as early as 2016 with your report, but, let's face it, this is not for the auto industry, this isn't about safety, this is about money. This is about using free spectrum to provide commercial applications that feed off the private information that they collect out of their cars. And, they get very offended when you point this out to them. But the fact is that we and other consumer groups, including some of the consumer groups that actually support maintaining the entire allocation for safety use, have pressed the auto industry to say, well, okay, will you take a non-commercial condition? And they never will. And when you ask what is the information that requires so much bandwidth that you need all 75? Because things like auto telemetry and, oh my God, there's a car around the corner, don't take a lot of bandwidth. So what is taking up the bandwidth? And they kind of hem and haw, but the thing that in their business plans take up all that bandwidth is personalized advertising as you're driving past, a McDonald's or a movie theater, infotainment, all these things that have nothing whatsoever to do with safety, but have everything to do with leveraging free spectrum for their own advantage.
Yeah, and to that point, I think the record before the commission has been pretty clear that 30 megahertz is enough for kind of those core latency sensitive, safety critical messages that are required for collision avoidance. So, the CV2X community has been clear that they're only going to use one 20 megahertz channel for safety for that collision avoidance messaging. And we also know that everything that DOT envisioned back in back when they were looking at mandating vehicle to vehicle technology in the 5.9 band, when that was on the table, they had to deliver all of those basic safety messages in one 10 megahertz channel. So, as Deb pointed out, 30 megahertz still puts the US squarely within international efforts on ITS as well, where there's still sort of no widespread agreement on harmonization, either for the technology or the spectrum. So, we really think that the record is clear, and the FCC, would be making a good decision here in November to decide, look, this is supposed to be, when we're subsidizing, spectrum, giving it away for free without an auction and without any kind of sharing requirement. Let's do that for a core safety purpose, and let's limit the amount of spectrum needed just for that, just for those core safety opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, the critical safety use, the talking cars signaling, is inherently a narrowband thing. And as you're saying, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, for DSRC, they require that all that vehicle-to-vehicle signaling be done on a single 10 megahertz basic safety message channel. 10 megahertz was it for V2V. Of course, you can add channels for first responders. You can add one for them. You could perhaps add another. But Europe is at 30 for both services to share for now. Everything seems to be moving to C-V2X. But unless you're using it for commercial purposes, the FCC seems, in line with the world on that point. Mark, do you have anything? Because I think we're out of time.
Yeah, given the improvements that have happened in radio technology over the last 20 years and radio technology, modulation, throughput, the throughput that was envisioned in the 75 megahertz 20 years ago is vastly eclipsed by the throughput you can get in a 30 megahertz channel nowadays. So there's nothing that was envisioned 20 years ago when they were given the 75 megahertz that won't fit in 30 megahertz today. And that same sort of scenario has happened in many other licensed spectrums as well. Narrowbanding has happened in many other pieces of radio spectrum where it's been compressed or narrowed as technology has improved. So I don't see this as anything new or unusual. The FCC is doing is pushing them to a narrower band while still having the same throughput.
Yeah, and you're also reminding me when you talk about the improvements in, in throughput, is that the whole point of cellular V2X, of moving to that technology, is that the mobile carriers are involved, and it's supposed to be more integrated with their general purpose 5G networks. So to the extent that there's commercial operations, it can be, they can integrate through partnerships with the autos and compete with each other. We don't need to give them free spectrum to do that.
Yeah, you're still looking at the same, what they're looking at going forward is the same 5G technology with its vastly improved throughput in smaller channels or the same size channels.
Okay, so we are at time and even a couple minutes over maybe, so we can, I think Ellen would come back on, but I want to thank the panel for these excellent insights. We managed to cover all the top level points, so that I hope the audience out there will understand much better what the FCC is proposing to adopt at the November meeting. Ellen?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And I think this has been a great hour. And so I want to thank the chairman and to all our panelists for their thoughts, and particularly to OTI and ICLE for co-hosting with us today. And of course, thank you to everybody who joined us. If you have any questions for our presenters or questions about WiFiForward, please feel free to email us at info@wififorward.com or visit our website, wififorward.com. Thank you all very much and have a great day.